Some people are not abandoned. They are disposed of. There is a difference. Abandonment implies hesitation, a moment of regret, a backward glance, the ghost of something that once resembled care. Disposal is colder than that. Disposal is efficient. Disposal is what happens when a person has been reduced, in the mind of someone more powerful, from a human being to an inconvenience that needs to be cleared away. Juliet Sterling was disposed of on a blood moon night, in the rain, on cobblestones that didn't care whose blood they caught. She was beaten. She was broken. She was thrown off a cliff and left in a cursed forest to be finished off by whatever found her first. The people who did it thought that was the end of her story. They were catastrophically wrong. To understand what happened to Juliet Sterling on the night of the blood moon, you have to understand what she was and what that meant in the world she had the misfortune of being born into. She was an Omega. In the hierarchy of the pack world, that single word carried the weight of an entire life sentence. Not low-ranking. Not simply lower on the social ladder. Omega in the blood moon pack meant something closer to furniture. Present, occasionally useful, expected to take up minimal space and make minimal noise and express minimal opinion about what happened to it. Omega wolves were tolerated when they were convenient and discarded when they weren't. And the only time anyone in a position of power paid meaningful attention to an Omega was when they wanted something from one. Juliet had committed the particular, unforgivable crime of being beautiful. Not strategically beautiful. Not politically connected or wealthy or from a good bloodline. Just genuinely, effortlessly, inconveniently beautiful in the way that some people are without understanding what it costs them. Dark hair and dark eyes, and a quality of presence that made rooms notice her before she had said a word or done a single thing to deserve the attention. Silas Nightwood had noticed. Silas Nightwood, alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, was a man whose relationship with wanting things was quite simple. He saw, he coveted, and then he took, and the taking was always dressed up afterward in the language of destiny and entitlement because powerful men have always found ways to make their appetites sound like inevitabilities. He had forced the mating mark onto Juliet's neck in a fit of possessive ego. Not because he loved her, not because the moon goddess had led him to her, but because he had wanted to own the most beautiful thing in the room and he had the authority to make that happen without asking permission. The mark was barely a month old when the calculations shifted. Clara Era. The Beta's daughter. Wealthy, well-connected, surgically positioned within the pack's political machinery in a way that an orphaned Omega with no family and no allies could never be. If Silas wanted to expand the Blood Moon Pack's territorial claims and consolidate political alliances in the northern reaches, Clara Era was the strategic answer. She had the connections he needed, the family backing that translated into warriors and resources and influence, the specific kind of social currency that a mating bond with an Omega would never generate. Juliet, who had been marked without her consent, was now inconvenient without her permission. Clara Era, who had despised Juliet since long before Silas had ever looked at her, understood this perfectly. She understood it with the particular, practiced precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity and had spent considerable creative energy on what to do with it. The silver daggers appeared in Juliet's quarters on a Tuesday. The maps of pack patrol routes materialized alongside them. Detailed, accurate, the kind of intelligence that would be extraordinarily valuable to an enemy looking to exploit the Blood Moon Pack's defensive vulnerabilities. Planted with such careful, thorough attention to detail that when the enforcers discovered them, the frame was complete before anyone had thought to question whether it made any sense for Juliet, a powerless Omega with no allies and no motive, to be running a sophisticated espionage operation for the ironclad court. But logic, in moments designed to produce outrage, is an early casualty. The charges were high treason. The evidence was irrefutable, which is exactly how planted evidence is designed to appear. And the tribunal, If the word could be applied to what was essentially Silas Knightwood deciding in front of an audience that the outcome he had already chosen was justified by the evidence he had arranged, lasted approximately long enough to feel like due process without any of the complications of actually providing it. The Blood Moon courtyard was unforgiving even in daylight. On that night, in the rain, it was something else entirely. The cobblestones bit into Juliet's bare knees as she was forced down before the assembled pack. The medieval fortress rose above her on all sides, its stone gargoyles slicked black by the downpour, the torches in their iron brackets sputtering and struggling against the wind. The rain had been falling for hours by the time the tribunal concluded. It had soaked through her thin linen dress completely, plastered her dark hair to her bruised face, turned the courtyard into a shallow river of cold water that ran between the stones and carried away nothing except the evidence of what was about to happen. Silas stood above her on the dais. He wore his finest. He had dressed for this, she realized. He had dressed for the performance of authority, for the theater of justice, for the specific visual of a strong alpha dispensing righteous punishment on a traitor. He wore his finest while she kneeled in the rain in a dress that had cost less than his belt buckle, and the detail was so perfectly representative of every single dynamic of their brief, violent acquaintance that Juliet might have laughed if she had any capacity left for anything that wasn't pain. She tried to speak. She choked on blood first, a thin red thread that the rain immediately washed from the corner of her mouth, and then she found her voice and she pleaded her innocence. Not because she thought it would work. She was not naive enough to believe, by this point, that truth had any functional relevance to what was happening. She pleaded because she was 19 years old and she was not ready to die, and pleading was the only remaining option available to her. Clara Era kicked her. The blow landed on her shoulder, collapsing her sideways, fresh pain flaring through her collarbone on top of everything that was already broken and hurting. And Clara Era stood over her in her rich furs that repelled the rain. Because of course her furs repelled the rain. Of course everything about Clara Era was designed to repel the things that soaked and destroyed everyone else, and catalogued Juliet's alleged crimes with the fluent, detailed confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. Then Silas stepped off the dais. He crossed the flooded courtyard. He stopped with his iron-toed boots inches from her face. He reached down and grabbed her by the hair, dragging her up until she was eye level with the man who had marked her without asking and was now discarding her with the same energy, and he spoke the words. The rejection. Formal. Deliberate. Spoken with the dark, compelling authority of an alpha's command that doesn't merely communicate rejection but enacts it. Every word was a different kind of blow. And when the last word landed, the mating bond, the fragile, glowing thread of connection that the mark had placed in Juliet's soul without her permission, snapped. The snap of a mating bond is not metaphorical. It is not an emotional experience dressed up in physical language. It is a physical rupture of something that, even when it was unwanted and forced and had never carried the warmth it was supposed to carry, had still become structural. It had threaded itself into the architecture of her, and when Silas pulled it out by the roots, the architecture came with it. The pain was total. The kind of pain that sits above sensation, that occupies the place where self used to be, that makes the body scream in the animal, wordless way that bypasses dignity entirely. Juliet screamed. Her wolf, the quiet, resilient creature that had been her only consistent companion through everything, retreated. Not strategically. Not temporarily. With the slow, terrible surrender of something that has taken too much damage to remain on the surface. Her wolf went somewhere dark and very still and went entirely, completely silent. Silas dropped her back into the mud. He announced the sentence. Death, technically, was the word he used, but Silas Knightwood was a man who liked to describe cruelty as mercy, who preferred to leave his hands technically clean while directing other hands to do the actual work. He was not going to execute her himself. He was going to allow the pack its entertainment, and then cast what remained of her into the whispering woods, and allow the forest and its inhabitants to be the technical cause of death. This way he could say he had shown mercy. The enforcers descended. Juliet did not fight back. She was not physically capable of fighting back, and she was not psychologically in a place where fighting would have occurred to her as an option. But she did the only thing she was capable of doing in those minutes when the boots rained down and the pain became something that existed outside normal parameters of experience. She curled herself around her abdomen, fiercely, protectively, with the specific, instinctive ferocity of someone whose own survival has become secondary to something they are carrying. Because there was something she was carrying. Something Silas Knightwood did not know about. Something Clara did not know about. Something that had been the secret weight at the center of Juliet's chest since the morning she had realized, weeks before the forced mating, that she was no longer only one person. She was pregnant. And the child was not Silas Knightwood's. 6 weeks before Silas Knightwood ever looked at Juliet Sterling as something he wanted to own, she had found a dying wolf in the eastern stables. It was well past midnight. The stables were empty at that hour. The stable hands long since retired, the pack's horses settled, the only sound the low percussion of rain on the wooden roof and the occasional shift and breath of sleeping animals. Juliet had been there because the stables were one of the few places in the Blood Moon Fortress where an Omega could exist without attracting the attention of people who had decided that Omegas were appropriate targets for whatever mood they happened to be in that particular evening. She had almost tripped over him in the dark. A man. A wolf in man's form, collapsed in the deep straw of the last stable bay. His breathing shallow and wet, and clearly wrong in the way that breathing is wrong when the body has decided the situation is critical. An arrow, silver-tipped, the kind used specifically to slow a wolf's healing ability and ensure that an injury that should be survivable becomes one that isn't, was buried in his side, wrapped in what had once been a bandage and was now just a sodden, dark mass pressed ineffectively against the wound. He was burning with fever. He was also still alive, which, given how long the wound had clearly been untended, represented a significant act of stubbornness on the part of his body. Juliet had 2 options. She could leave. She could pretend she had seen nothing and go back to her room and let whatever was going to happen to the stranger in the stables happen without her involvement, and maintain the particular, exhausting invisibility that was her only reliable protection in the Blood Moon Fortress. Or she could do the thing that had always gotten her into trouble, the thing that she could never quite stop doing regardless of the risk, which was care about something. She stayed. For 3 nights, she returned to the stables. She cleaned the wound. She brought food. Small amounts, untraceable, the kind of thing an Omega could procure without anyone noticing she had taken slightly more than her own share. She changed the bandages. She sat in the dark with him through the worst of the fever, when he shook so violently that the hay around him rustled, and she talked, quietly, in the way you talk to someone when you're not entirely sure they can hear you but you believe, on some animal level, that the sound of a human voice is itself a kind of medicine. He told her his name was Kaelin. He told her he was a wanderer who had made the mistake of wandering into territory with people who didn't appreciate the intrusion. He told her this with the wry, self-deprecating quality of someone who is accustomed to editing the truth of their situation into something that protects the people around them from the consequences of knowing it. He did not tell her that he was a prince. He did not tell her that he was royalty from the very kingdom that the Blood Moon Pack considered its sworn enemy. He did not tell her these things because he had, in 3 nights of fever and weakness and whispered conversation in the dark, formed an opinion about Juliet Sterling's fundamental goodness, and he was not willing to make her responsible for harboring something she would be killed for harboring if it were discovered. He protected her by lying. She protected him by staying. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. The silver in the wound had been drawn out by the herbal poultices she had learned from the pack's older women. knowledge absorbed quietly over years, the way Omegas learn useful things, by watching and listening and not announcing that they are doing so. His color returned. His breathing evened out. And in the strange, temporary intimacy of shared crisis, in the dark of a stable in the middle of the night with the rain on the roof and the horses breathing slow around them, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden force of the bond that Silas would later force onto her neck. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. The specific chemistry of two people who have spent 3 days in close proximity to each other's vulnerability and have arrived at the wordless conclusion that the other person is, in some essential way, worth trusting. They had one night. One night before the fever was fully gone, and the wound was closed enough to hold, and the window of his ability to remain hidden in the Blood Moon stables had clearly expired. One night before the reality of his situation reasserted itself, and he would have to be gone before the morning stable hands arrived and found evidence of an intruder. One night of warmth in a life that Juliet had learned to expect very little warmth from. He was gone before sunrise. The stable bay was clean. He had taken care to leave no trace. The straw was smoothed. There was no blood, no bandage material, no evidence of occupation. If she hadn't lived those 3 nights in her own body, she could have convinced herself she had imagined him. He left one thing. Not intentionally. Not as a message or a memento. He left it because it was already there, already happening, already taking root in the quiet, biological reality of a body that does not wait for circumstances to be convenient before deciding what it is going to do next. He left a life. Juliet didn't know for almost 2 weeks. By the time she understood what was happening inside her, Silas had already looked at her across the great hall and decided she was going to be his. By the time the mating mark was forced onto her neck, the pregnancy was already 7 weeks along. Early enough to hide beneath loose clothing, beneath the disorientation of the forced bond, beneath the chaos of a pack that was too focused on celebrating its alpha's acquisition to look closely at the omega he had acquired. She hid it. Every single day, she hid it. She hid it through the growing suspicion in Clarara's eyes. She hid it through Silas's increasingly erratic attention, the weeks of possession followed by the weeks of strategic neglect, as he began calculating what Clarara could offer him that Juliet couldn't. She hid it through the tribunal, curling her arms fiercely around the small swell of her abdomen while the enforcers did their work, taking blow after blow with the specific, single-minded determination of someone who has decided that their own survival is optional but this particular secret is not. She did not know who Kaelin was. She did not know that the man with the amber eyes and the quiet, protecting lies, had been born into the royal family of the ironclad court. She did not know that the father of her child was the younger brother of the most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories. She did not know that the wound that had killed him, the silver arrow, the poisoned tip, had been part of a deliberate, coordinated ambush that his brother had spent 3 years investigating without resolution. She knew only that he had been brave, and gentle, and gone. She knew that whatever she was carrying was the last evidence that he had existed. And that evidence, as the enforcers threw her over the cliff and the whispering woods rose up to receive her, was the only thing she was still fighting for. SFX. Wind. The sound of a body falling through branches. Then silence. The forest floor received her with the absolute, indifferent brutality of gravity. She did not lose consciousness immediately. She had time, a short, agonizing period of absolute awareness, to understand the inventory of damage. Her left leg was wrong in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Her ribs, already cracked from the courtyard, had taken the full weight of impact on top of prior damage. Her right arm had gone numb somewhere in the fall through the branches. Her face was a catalogue of everything the cobblestones had already done to it, compounded by bark and branch and the cold forest floor. Then the darkness came, and she let it, because the darkness was the only available alternative to lying still and cataloguing the pain indefinitely. She woke up to the smell of rotting leaves. She had no way of knowing how much time had passed. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The cold was the kind that doesn't stay on the skin. It had worked its way past skin and muscle into the marrow of her bones, sitting there with the permanent quality of something that has decided it belongs. The whispering woods were alive around her in the way that cursed places are alive, with sounds and movements at the edge of perception, with a specific crawling sensation of being watched from multiple directions by things that have not yet decided what to do about her. Her wolf was still silent. The bond was gone. The thread that had been severed in the courtyard had left a silence in her internal landscape that was almost louder than pain, the specific, echoing emptiness of a space that had been occupied and was now hollow. But something else was present. Something that was not her wolf and was not the remnant of a bond and was not anything she had a formal framework for. Something that rose up through the pain and the cold and the impossible arithmetic of her injuries and said, with the quiet, absolute authority of the most fundamental biological drive in existence, "Get up. Move. There is something you are responsible for, and it has not been born yet, and you have not finished." She dragged herself through the underbrush on one functional arm, and the stubbornness of someone who has found, in the worst possible moment, the one thing worth surviving for. She moved for hours. She didn't know where she was going. The whispering woods were notoriously disorienting, a labyrinth of ancient trees and wrong-feeling paths, where the normal sensory cues that a wolf uses to navigate become unreliable and strange. Feral rogues used this forest as cover. Predators that had been old when the pack system was young still moved through it in the dark. The ironclad quartz patrols ran along its northern edge. The fever hit her somewhere around what she estimated was the second hour. When the fever came, it brought company. Not real company, hallucinatory company, the fever's particular cruelty of filling the solitude with faces. She saw Kaelin in the mist ahead of her, amber eyes steady and patient, urging her forward in the way that the dead urge the living in places between sleep and waking. She saw Silas standing over something she didn't want to look at. She saw Clarara's face and the smug certainty of someone who believes they have won. She kept moving. Until she couldn't. She collapsed at the base of a massive oak tree, its roots forming a shallow cup in the earth that held her like reluctant hands. Her breathing had become something she was managing consciously, each inhale a negotiation between her lungs and the damage in her ribs. Her hand rested, as it had rested through every moment of the fall and the crawl and the fever, over the curve of her abdomen. She had tried. The darkness at the edges of her vision was no longer retreating when she focused. It was advancing, patient and absolute, and entirely indifferent to whether she was ready for it. She closed her eyes. The forest floor was wet and cold and smelled of centuries of falling leaves. She let go. And that was when the ground began to shake. Not with the scattered, randomized pattern of animals moving through undergrowth. With the deliberate, coordinated rhythm of a patrol. Something immense and disciplined, moving through the whispering woods with the confidence of something that does not need to fear what lives there because it is the most frightening thing in the vicinity. Through the fog, the silhouettes emerged. Wolves, but not the kind the Blood Moon pack fielded. These were the size of draft horses, their fur thick and matted in the practical, unsentimental way of animals built for function rather than appearance, their harnesses scarred leather and dark iron rather than the decorative strapping of ceremonial wolves. The iron-clad court. Juliet's last coherent thought, before the events of the next several minutes were taken entirely out of her hands, was that she had survived a beating, a rejection, a cliff, and a cursed forest, only to be found by the sworn enemies of the pack whose scent she still, faintly, carried. She thought, of course. And then the largest wolf of them all stepped into the clearing where she lay at the base of the oak tree, and she felt its gaze find her through the fog, and she understood that whatever was about to happen was happening regardless of anything she thought or felt about it. The Alpha King of the Ironclad Court had found her. King Ambrose of the Ironclad Court was not a man who inspired descriptions that involved words like warm or approachable or gentle. The descriptions that circulated about him in the territories, whispered among pack wolves as cautionary tales, deployed by mothers to make pups behave, referenced in diplomatic correspondence with a careful, precise neutrality of people who are trying to communicate danger without provoking the thing they're describing, were words like ruthless and precise and terrifying and, occasionally, magnificent in the way that natural disasters are magnificent, which is to say beautiful and worth observing from a very significant distance. He was a king who had ruled through strength so absolute and consistent that it had eventually stopped needing to prove itself. He did not manage the Ironclad Court's reputation for ferocity through performance or demonstration. It had simply accumulated over decades, through the territorial wars he had ended, through the challenges he had met, through the way that other alphas spoke his name when they thought he wasn't listening, with the involuntary lowering of volume that belongs to words that carry their own weight. He was enormous. Not just tall, enormous in the way that some people are, where size is the least of what makes them large, where the space they displace when they enter a room is somehow more than their physical dimensions can account for. The armor he wore in the field was dark steel built for function rather than ceremony. The cloak at his shoulders was bare fur, dense and dark, worn with the casualness of someone who put it on in the morning without thinking about what it communicated. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old battle scars, framed by raven-black hair that he had apparently decided was his own business, and it was the face of someone who had been making hard decisions for a very long time and had made peace with the weight of them. His eyes, in the torchlight, were a cold and burning blue. Not unkind in structure, the eyes themselves were large and well-shaped and built, biologically, for a different expression than the one they habitually wore. But they carried the temperature of a man who had spent years ensuring that warmth was something he extended on his terms and nobody else's, and that the default setting was something considerably more controlled. He looked down at Juliet Sterling in the roots of the oak tree. He saw what was there to see. A small, broken woman, barely conscious, soaked through, with the fading residue of a blood moon mating mark on her neck and the unmistakable evidence of violence documented all over her. He catalogued it with the rapid, clinical efficiency of a trained military mind assessing a situation. He registered the blood moon scent, the scent of his sworn enemy, the pack he despised with the focused, carefully maintained quality of hatred that has been sustained over years through genuine cause. And his face did what his face did when he encountered things associated with that particular enemy. He raised his sword. He was, genuinely, intending to end it quickly. Not from cruelty. Cruelty implies a kind of enthusiasm for suffering that Ambrose had never possessed. From practicality. She was dying. She was connected, by scent and by mark, to a pack he was at war with. Whatever story had produced her current condition was a story he did not have time for in the middle of a patrol through a cursed forest at night. And then he bent over her to deliver the blow. And his senses, the senses of an alpha king, the sharpest and most precisely calibrated of any wolf alive, honed by decades of survival in situations that did not allow for sensory imprecision, delivered him information that his mind refused, for several seconds, to process. He inhaled. He smelled the rotting leaves. He smelled the metallic quality of her blood. He smelled the fading, putrid remnant of Silas Knightwood's mark, which he identified and categorized with the automatic revulsion of a system that had been trained to register that particular scent as hostile. And then, beneath all of that, buried deep beneath the surface information, emanating from somewhere internal, from the warmth of a living body that was the only warm thing within miles, he smelled something else. Something so familiar that it stopped him as completely as a wall. winter pine and crushed iron. The specific, unrepeatable, entirely unique scent of his own bloodline. Not his. Not the broad signature of the ironclad royal line in general, though that was present too, layered beneath. The specific, individual scent marker of one particular person. A person whose scent Ambrose had spent 3 years trying to find in forests and fields and diplomatic ruins, and the cold evidence of ambush sites where the only thing left was blood and silence. His brother. His younger brother Kalen, who had crossed the southern border 3 years ago on a mission that was supposed to be diplomatically routine and had never returned, whose escort had been found massacred, whose body had never been found, whose death had been the assumption that Ambrose had spent 3 years refusing to fully accept even while accepting it functionally in every other way because the alternative, the hope that Kalen was somewhere, alive, findable, was a hope too painful to maintain indefinitely without evidence. The sword dropped. It fell from the hand of a man who had never, in anyone's documented memory, let go of a weapon involuntarily. It plunged point first into the mud of the forest floor and stood there, vibrating slightly with the impact, as Ambrose dropped to his knees beside the dying woman and leaned his face close to the evidence of the most significant discovery of his life in the most improbable location. The scent was coming from within her. Not from her. From within her. From the life she was carrying, already formed enough to have its own scent signature, already expressing the genetic material of its father in the specific, biological language that wolves read more accurately than any words. His brother had not died immediately. His brother had found shelter. Had been tended to. Had, despite the silver poison, despite the wound, despite everything the ambush had intended, survived long enough to leave something behind. Not just a memory. Not just the grief that Ambrose had been carrying for 3 years like a stone in his chest, but a child. The heir. The continuation of a bloodline that Ambrose had believed, for 3 years, had been cut off entirely. His hands were shaking. Ambrose, the Alpha King whose hands were steady enough to conduct surgical precision in the middle of combat, was kneeling in the mud of the Whispering Woods with shaking hands, staring at a dying woman who was carrying his dead brother's child. He looked at her face. She was barely there. The fever had taken most of her to somewhere unreachable. But some lucid thread remained, some wire-thin filament of consciousness that had not yet released its grip, because her lips moved. She told him about Kalen. Not his name first. Not his identity. She told him in the fragmentary, barely audible way of someone who has already said their goodbyes and is delivering a last message rather than a full account. She told him about the stables and the 3 nights and the amber eyes and the way he had faded fast, so fast, faster than she could stop, from the silver in his blood. She told him the name. And Ambrose let out a sound that the Whispering Woods would not forget. It was not a roar. It was not a command. It was the sound of a man who has been carrying something impossibly heavy for 3 years, in isolation, without anyone who fully understood the weight of it, being suddenly and completely undone. Not by the grief, which he had already learned to live alongside, but by the hope he had stopped allowing himself, arriving all at once in the form of a scent and a name and a half-conscious woman in a forest who had protected the last piece of his brother with her own body. He gathered her up. All of her. The broken bones, the fever, the ruined dress, the mud, the evidence of everything the Blood Moon Pack had done to her, with the astonishing, specific gentleness of someone who understands, at a cellular level, that this particular object is irreplaceable and must be handled accordingly. He ordered his men to move. And if any of them died to ensure she reached the royal healers in time, he made absolutely clear that this was an acceptable and expected use of their service. The darkness took Juliet before the trees thinned. The last thing she registered was warmth. The warmth of the king's cloak, pulled tightly around her. The warmth of his chest against her cheek as he ran. And beneath the terror and the pain and the silence of her wolf and the echo of everything the blood moon had done to her, a strange, unfamiliar sensation that she would later identify, in the safety of a bed with clean sheets and a fire that didn't have to fight the rain to stay lit, as the feeling of being held by someone who is not going to let go. Consciousness returned to Juliet the way tides return, not in a single wave but in repeated approaches, each one reaching slightly further than the last before retreating, until finally the sea decides it is going to stay. She was aware of the bed first. Not abstractly aware. Physically, viscerally, gratefully aware, in the way you are aware of a thing when its opposite has been your recent reality. The mattress beneath her was thick and real and entirely horizontal, which was the most significant thing about it. She had been sleeping on floors and in straw and on mud and on the cold cobblestones of a courtyard for long enough that horizontal and soft and warm had taken on the quality of luxuries she had stopped expecting to encounter again. The furs above her were heavy. Dire wolf pelts. She could identify the texture even through the fog of recovery. The room's walls were dark polished stone, the kind that takes on a golden quality in firelight and keeps a fire's warmth for hours after the flames have been banked. The hearth was the size of a small cabin. The fire in it was aggressively large, in the way of fires built by people who take warmth seriously and have the resources to maintain their position. She was in iron hold. She was in the heart of the fortress she had been told her entire life to fear. And she was alive. The healer who attended her was a woman of silver hair and iron practicality. Beatrice, she introduced herself without ceremony, the way people who have spent their careers doing useful things in urgent circumstances introduce themselves, with their name and their purpose and nothing wasted on performance. She had the hands of someone who had been working with broken things for a very long time and had developed the specific, calibrated efficiency of mastery. She tended to Juliet's injuries with a kind of focused competence that is its own form of kindness. Not warmth, exactly, but reliability, and in Juliet's experience reliability was considerably rarer and more valuable than warmth. She told Juliet that her ribs were still knitting together, that the leg would heal cleanly if she stayed off it, that the fever had broken on its own, which was, in Beatrice's professional opinion, a form of stubbornness she had not previously encountered at such a pronounced level in someone of Juliet's size. She told her the child was strong. And then the door opened and King Ambrose walked in. He looked different in the firelight of the chamber than he had in the mist of the whispering woods. The bear fur cloak was gone. The dark steel armor was gone. He wore a simple black linen tunic and trousers, both plain and well-made in the way of someone who has long since stopped using clothing to communicate anything other than practicality. His arms, uncovered to the elbow, were corded with muscle and thick with the accumulated scar tissue of a military life. Each scar a sentence in a language that spoke of threats survived and decisions made under conditions that did not allow for hesitation. But it was his face that arrested her. Not the scarring, not the harsh angles, not the strong jaw that looked like it had been built specifically for withstanding bad news without showing it. It was his eyes. The cold blue flames that had regarded her with disgusted efficiency in the forest were somewhere less prominent today. What was present instead was something that looked entirely unfamiliar on a face structured for authority. A raw, unguarded vulnerability, the specific open quality of grief that has been private for too long and has suddenly been given permission to be real. He sat beside the bed. He didn't stand over her. He pulled up a chair and sat down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of someone who has something important to say and is taking the time to say it properly, not issuing it from a standing position as a declaration but delivering it at eye level as a truth. He told her about Kaelin. Not everything. Grief is not something that releases all of itself at once. But the essential architecture, the younger brother, the heir, the diplomatic mission 3 years ago that had ended in the silence of an ambush site with no survivors and no body and no explanation that answered all the questions it raised. He told her that he had spent 3 years hunting the truth of what had happened, following trails that went cold and cold and cold again, and that every trail had ended without the one answer that mattered, which was where his brother was. He told her that the scent in the forest had been the first answer in 3 years. Juliet told him about Kaelin. She told him the truth of it. The stables, the 3 nights, the silver wound, the way Kaelin had protected her even through fever by refusing to tell her who he was. She told him about the amber eyes and the way the dawn had come and Kaelin had been gone and the straw had been smoothed over as if he had never been there at all. She told him all of it, and she watched Ambrose's jaw work through the telling, watched the muscle in his cheek tick with the effort of maintaining composure in the face of information that was simultaneously the worst thing and the best thing he had ever been told. The worst. Kaelin had been dying in a stable, within reach of the very people who had ambushed him, and had told no one who he was because protecting a stranger had felt more important than saving himself. The best. Kaelin had not died alone. He had been warm. He had been tended to. He had spent his last days in the company of genuine kindness rather than the cold of abandonment, and he had left behind, in the body of the woman brave enough to offer that kindness, the proof that he had been there. Ambrose reached out and placed his massive, calloused hand carefully over the furs covering Juliet's stomach. He told her she was not a prisoner. He told her the fortress was her sanctuary. He used the language of protection, absolute, unconditional, backed by the authority of someone who had the genuine power to enforce it, and he used it with the specific, deliberate weight of a man who is making a vow rather than a statement. Anyone who disrespected her would lose their eyes. Anyone who tried to harm her would lose their head. Juliet had been told things like this before. By Silas, who had mocked her and then used her as political collateral and arranged her murder when she became inconvenient. By pack hierarchy, which had promised Omega's protection and delivered them to whoever found them useful to exploit. She knew the difference, she realized, between someone saying the words and someone meaning them, because the difference was visible in the quality of stillness that followed. Silas had made declarations with the showiness of someone who wanted the room to react. Ambrose made this one with the quiet of someone who does not need the room to react because the room already understands that he does not make statements he does not intend to back with everything available to him. She chose to believe him. Not because she had run out of reasons to distrust men with power. She had not run out. She had accumulated those reasons with extraordinary efficiency in the preceding months. She chose to believe him because the alternative, the armor of permanent disbelief, the refusal to let anything land as genuine, was a way of surviving that also prevented the kind of living that had a point. She had nearly died in a forest for the right to keep going. She was going to keep going. The weeks that followed rewrote her understanding of what a pack could be. The ironclad court was harsh in the way that northern places are harsh, built for endurance rather than comfort, organized around martial strength and practical loyalty, not given to ornament or excess or the elaborate social performance that the Blood Moon pack had mistaken for culture. But within that harshness there was something Juliet had not experienced in any pack she had known. Consistency. The wolves of Ironhold did not blow hot and cold based on whose favor was ascendant that week. They did not recalibrate their treatment of her based on whispered politics or shifting alliances or whatever the alpha was in the mood for that morning. They treated her the way Ambrose had established she was to be treated, with the specific respect owed to the mother of the ironclad prince, and they maintained that treatment with the reliable consistency of people whose loyalty is genuine rather than strategic. Beatrice tended to her daily with the focused attention of someone whose professional purpose had been engaged at full capacity. Commander Rodri, Ambrose's second, personally escorted her on the brief walks along the snow-covered battlements that were allowed as her strength returned, walking slightly behind her, not crowding, but present in the way a bodyguard is present when they take their assignment seriously. And Ambrose was simply there. He did not perform presence. He did not make elaborate gestures of protection or spend hours articulating his intentions. He existed in her vicinity with the calm, consistent, enormous steadiness of something that has decided where it is and is not going anywhere. He sat in the library while she rested, reading across the table from her in silence. He checked in with Beatrice twice daily. He appeared without announcement, when her fever spiked again in the second week, and sat beside the bed until it broke. The terror she had felt toward him in the forest was not gone, but it was transforming. Terror, when it encounters consistent evidence that it has been misdirected, does not simply disappear, it reconfigures. It becomes something more complex and more useful. It becomes the specific, earned respect of someone who has looked at a powerful thing clearly and found that the power, while undeniable, is pointed in a direction they can trust. He was ruthless. She saw evidence of it in how he dealt with people who violated his standards. Decisive, immediate, without extended deliberation or the kind of mercy that invites repetition. But the ruthlessness was directed. It had an architecture. It was not the random, ego-driven brutality of Silas Knightwood. It was the weaponized precision of a man who had decided long ago what he was willing to be merciless about and what he was not. He was not willing to be merciless about things under his protection. Juliet was under his protection. The child she was carrying was the most important person in the ironclad court. And as the months passed and her body healed and the child grew and the relationship between them settled into something that neither of them had a clean word for. Not friendship, exactly, not family in any conventional sense, but something in the territory between them, built from shared grief and shared stake and the daily reality of existing in close proximity to someone whose fundamental character you have come to trust. The Blood Moon pack began to look very small and very far away. And then, in the cold clarity of a morning 3 weeks before Juliet's time, the Raven arrived. Silas Knightwood had discovered she was alive. Not alive in the abstract. Not the vague, uncomfortable possibility that an Omega thrown off a cliff might have survived the fall. He knew she was alive and housed in iron hold and heavily pregnant, and whoever had carried that intelligence to him had also carried, presumably, whatever details made the pregnancy relevant to his calculations. Clarera had been proven barren. This detail, which had been whispered through the Blood Moon Pack's gossip networks with a particular, gleeful cruelty that Pack gossip reserves for the powerful, had apparently reached Silas with the force of a strategic disaster. The legacy he had believed was secured through Clarera's connections was now undermined by her biology. The future he had arranged, the disposal of Juliet, the elevation of Clarera, the continuation of the Knightwood line, had developed a catastrophic structural problem. And he had heard about the pregnant Omega in Iron Hold. He had assumed, with the specific blend of arrogance and delusion that defines men who have never seriously questioned their own centrality to events, that the child was his. That the timing of the forced mating and the subsequent pregnancy was simple and obvious and required no further investigation. He had marked her. She was pregnant. The mathematics were, in his assessment, straightforward. He had marched 500 wolves to the border of a kingdom whose king he had spent years provoking. The audacity of this required a specific kind of confidence in one's own position that the facts of the situation would have, if Silas had been the kind of man who examined facts, immediately corrected. But Silas was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who had spent 3 decades having his assumptions confirmed by the simple mechanism of being the most powerful person in the room, and who had therefore lost the habit of examining assumptions before acting on them. He marched 500 wolves to the Frostbite Ravine. He demanded from the southern ridge the return of his mate and his heir. Ambrose stood at the northern edge of the ravine with 20 men. 20. Not because he had failed to bring more. Not because the logistical challenge of mobilizing the ironclad court's full military force on short notice had resulted in a reduced contingent. Ambrose had chosen 20 because 20 was what he needed, and bringing more would have communicated something he didn't want to communicate, which was that Silas Knightwood was the kind of threat that required Ambrose to fully arm himself. Ambrose did not fully arm himself to face Silas Knightwood. He wore his bear fur cloak and his black linen tunic, and the expression of a man who is dealing with a minor administrative matter that has chosen an unnecessarily dramatic venue for itself. Juliet stood behind him, wrapped in layers of pelts, trembling, not from the cold and not from weakness but from the specific, visceral terror of seeing the face of the man who had beaten her and rejected her and thrown her off a cliff, from a distance of 30 feet, looking at her with the possessive hunger of someone who has decided that the thing they discarded is now worth reclaiming because it has acquired new value. She watched Silas look at her. She watched him look at the obvious swell of her pregnancy. She watched the greedy, possessive calculation move across his face like weather. And she felt Ambrose's hand reach back and close over hers. Not gently. Firmly. The way you hold something when you want it to know, without any ambiguity, that it is not going anywhere. What happened at the ravine unfolded over a very short period of time. Silas made his demands from the southern ridge with the projecting confidence of a man who believes his 500 wolves are a sufficient argument for anything. He invoked pack law. He cited custody rights. He announced, with the breathtaking entitlement of someone who has never had to examine his own logic, that Juliet and the unborn child would be returned to him, and that Juliet would serve as the wet nurse for her own child while Clararera raised it as the blood moon heir. The wet nurse. For her own child. Ambrose's response was not loud. It was never loud. But it carried the specific, devastating quality of information delivered from a position of absolute certainty, with the full resonant authority of an Alpha King's command behind it. The kind of voice that doesn't just travel across a ravine but rearranges the molecules in the air on the other side. He told Silas that the child carried no drop of his blood. He let that land. He let the silence that followed it stretch to the length where silence becomes its own kind of statement. He let Silas's warriors begin to understand, one by one, the implication of what their alpha had dragged them to the border to claim. He let Clarara's face rearrange itself from triumphant to something considerably less composed. And then he told them whose blood the child did carry. The name of Prince Kalen of the ironclad court fell into the frostbite ravine like a stone into deep water. The ripple that came back was not confusion. It was horror. Because Silas Knightwood knew the name. Silas Knightwood had specific, personal, deeply implicating reasons to know the name Kalen of the ironclad court. He knew about the ambush, 3 years ago, on the southern border. He knew about the diplomatic escort that had been slaughtered. He knew about the silver-tipped arrows and the coordinated nature of the attack, and the fact that the body of the ironclad prince had never been found because the ironclad prince had not died immediately in the ambush. He had survived. He had dragged himself to shelter within Blood Moon territory. He had been tended to by an Omega in the eastern stables who had no idea what she was harboring. And he had died there, slowly, from the silver in his blood, leaving behind a child that Silas had subsequently beaten and rejected and thrown off a cliff without ever knowing it carried the blood of the exact enemy Silas had been most afraid of. The Blood Moon Alpha had not merely beaten and discarded his own mate. He had attempted to murder the heir to the ironclad throne. The warriors standing behind Silas understood what this meant before he did. Silas tried to argue. He tried the word lie, and then he tried the word trick, and then, as Ambrose's blue eyes came to rest on him with the specific, flat quality of a man who has decided that the talking portion of an interaction has concluded, he tried nothing further because there was nothing further available to try. He attempted, briefly, to run. What happened then lasted approximately the duration of a thunderclap. Ambrose shifted mid-stride, the transformation blurring from man to wolf in the fluid, terrifying way that belongs only to the most powerful of alphas, the kind for whom the shift is not an effort but an expression, and cleared 40 feet of ravine in a single leap, landing among the Blood Moon front lines with the impact of something that understands gravity as a tool rather than a constraint. The Blood Moon warriors scattered. Not fighting. Not retreating in any organized tactical sense. Simply dissolving, dropping weapons, baring necks, pressing their chests to the frozen ground in the instinctive, involuntary submission of wolves who have encountered something their animal minds have recognized as categorically outside the territory of things they are equipped to challenge. Only the elite enforcers stood their ground, and they didn't stand it for long. Silas could not shift. He tried. He stood at the edge of the ravine with his 500 warriors dissolving around him and tried to call his wolf up from wherever fear had driven it, and his wolf would not come, because his wolf understood something that his ego had not yet processed, which was that the creature approaching him across the frozen ground was a natural force that Silas Nightwood had been profoundly mistaken to treat as a peer. The black wolf took him down. Slowly. Deliberately. Not with the clean, quick efficiency of mercy but with the patient, specific weight of a judgment being executed. The massive paws pressed Silas into the frozen earth and held him there, and Ambrose looked back across the ravine to where Juliet stood. Their eyes met. She did not look away. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not pity, not guilt, not the complicated human ambivalence that sometimes attaches itself to the destruction of even a terrible thing. She felt clear. The particular clarity that belongs to the moment when something that has been threatening you for a very long time is finally, permanently, addressed. She gave a single, slow nod. And the Alpha King of the ironclad court honored it. The Frostbite Ravine was quiet by the time it was over. The Blood Moon warriors who remained, the vast majority, who had surrendered at the first demand of the wolf's presence, stood in the snow with the specific, newly homeless quality of men whose leadership has just been permanently concluded and who are waiting for instruction from whoever replaces it. Clara Era had been taken into custody before she had made it 10 steps into her attempted retreat. Commander Rodri stood at the center of the captured contingent with the methodical competence of someone who has done this before and knows exactly which forms the next several hours of logistics will take. The war that Silas had brought to the wrong door was over before it had properly begun. Juliet stood on the northern ridge in the cold, watching it end, her hands clasped over the curve of her abdomen. She had been disposed of. She had been thrown away, literally, from a height designed to ensure she did not come back. She had come back. But here is the thing, the part that nobody talks about when they tell stories about triumphant survival, the part that gets glossed over in favor of the dramatic resolution and the enemies defeated and the justice arrived. Here is what nobody tells you about the moment after everything changes in your favor. You are still who you were in the forest. The bones that broke in the fall have healed, but they broke. The bond that was severed in the courtyard is gone, but it left a scar in the architecture of what she was. The months of hiding and pretending and curling her body protectively around a secret while other people made decisions about her survival, those months do not simply dissolve because the morning after them happened to contain a king and a sword and a declaration of war that lasted 12 minutes. And as Juliet stood on the northern ridge and watched the last of the Blood Moon warriors submit to the ironclad guard, she felt something that she was not prepared for. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Questions. Specific questions that had been waiting, with considerable patience, for a moment when the immediate crisis had resolved enough to allow them to the surface. Questions about Kaelin. Not the ones she had answered for Ambrose. Not the sequence of events, the stables, the 3 nights, the amber eyes. Different questions. The ones that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the day she first understood what she was carrying, accumulating context with each passing week in Ironhold, becoming more specific and more urgent as the child grew and the scent of winter pine and iron became less abstract and more real and more present in everything around her. Questions about who Kaelin had actually been traveling to meet. Questions about what a diplomatic mission that was supposed to be routine had actually been carrying. Questions about why, of all the places in Blood Moon territory a wounded and dying prince could have found shelter, he had found his way to the eastern stables, the one place in the fortress that an Omega was likely to be alone at midnight, the one place where he could be certain of encountering someone with no political incentive to hand him over. Questions about whether Kaelin's amber eyes and his careful lies and his decision to protect her by not telling her who he was had been entirely the spontaneous product of fever and gratitude, or whether some part of the path that had led her here, the stables, the child, the cliff, the forest, the king who had found her, had been, in some way she didn't yet understand, not entirely accidental. She looked down at her hands. She felt the child move, a slow, rolling pressure from the inside that she had learned, over months, to read the way you learn to read the particular quality of weather. The child was restless. The child had been restless since the morning of the ravine, since the ground had shaken with the impact of his uncle's wolf clearing 40 feet of frozen air, since the reverberations of an alpha king's roar had traveled across the snow and reached, somehow, the small and enclosed warmth of where the child lived. She pressed her palms flat against herself. She thought about questions that didn't have answers yet. She thought about Beatrice, who had mentioned offhandedly, in the second week of her recovery, that the ironclad courts records from 3 years ago had a gap in them. A small gap, barely significant, the kind that administrative errors produce when people are moving quickly in crisis conditions. A gap that covered the 12 days before Kaelin's diplomatic escort had been found slaughtered. 12 days that no one had fully accounted for. 12 days during which the official record said Kaelin had been traveling through neutral territory on a pre-established diplomatic route, and which the intelligence reports from the same period described, in 3 separate documents, as a variation that deviated from the established route without any recorded explanation. The variation had taken him south, into Blood Moon territory. She had assumed it was the wound, that the ambush had happened and he had stumbled south trying to find shelter and had ended up, by the logic of injury and exhaustion and desperation, in the one place he could hide. But ambushes happen to people who were where they were expected to be. And if Kaelin had deviated south before the ambush, not after, not as a consequence of injury, but before, on a route that wasn't his established diplomatic path, then the ambush had happened to someone who was already somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Which meant someone had known where he was going. And the child moved again, and Juliet drew breath, and the snow fell slowly over the frostbite ravine, and she thought about a question she had not yet asked anyone in Ironhold. Why had Kaelin really been there? What had he actually been doing in Blood Moon territory? And who, other than the people who had sent the ambush, had known he would be? She was going to find out. Not today. Not this month. Not while the child was still growing and her body was still rebuilding and the political aftermath of the frostbite ravine was still being organized into coherent consequence. But she was going to find out, because she had spent the last several months learning something important about herself. She was not, and had never been, someone who could leave a question alone once it had taken root. And this question, the one about Kaelin's route, about the 12 missing days, about whoever had known enough to intercept a prince on a path he wasn't supposed to be on, this question was already rooted deep. She would ask Ambrose. Tomorrow. Or she would ask Beatrice, who had the cautious, precise air of someone sitting on information they were not sure how to deliver. Or she would search the library herself, because she had discovered in the months of recovery that Ironhold's historical records were extraordinary, comprehensive and detailed and, unlike the Blood Moon fortress's convenient gaps, apparently committed to accuracy over narrative. She would start searching. And she did not yet know what she would find. She did not yet know that the question about Kaelin's route would pull on a thread that, when pulled, would unravel something so much larger than an ambush. Something that connected to the Blood Moon Pack's political ambitions, to Ambrose's history, to the ironclad court's own buried complexities. Something that would reveal, in the inexorable way that true things eventually insist on being visible, that the night Kaelin had died in the eastern stables had not been an accident of war. It had been the end of something someone had worked very hard to make appear accidental. And the child she was carrying, the one with the amber eyes she hadn't yet seen but already knew, was not just an heir. He was evidence. And that is where we leave Juliet Sterling tonight. Healed. Avenged. Safe inside walls that actually mean it when they say sanctuary. The man who sold her is dead. The man who framed her is in custody. The man who threw her off a cliff will answer to a court that does not arrange its verdicts in advance. By every measure of the story we have told so far, she has won. And yet, there is a question she has not asked yet. A gap in a record that someone hoped nobody would ever find. 12 missing days and a prince who deviated from his route before anyone tried to kill him, which means someone knew where he was going before the ambush, which means someone inside the world Juliet now calls home may have been part of it. The child with the amber eyes is coming soon. And when he arrives, the story changes again. I need one thing from you before part 2 drops. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the bell, turn on notifications, because part 2 is coming, and it goes somewhere none of you are expecting. What Juliet finds in those records. What the 12 missing days actually contained. And what the birth of the ironclad prince sets in motion that no one, not Ambrose, not Beatrice, not even the person who arranged Kaelin's death, has prepared for. You do not want to miss it. And leave me a comment right now. Tell me what you think Kaelin was really doing in Blood Moon territory. Tell me who you think knew he was coming. Tell me if you think someone inside Ironhold is still hiding something. And, because I read every single one, tell me where in the world you are watching from. Drop your country, your city, your corner of the world. I want to know where Juliet's story is traveling. She survived the woods. She survived the wolves. Part 2 is where we find out what she's actually made of. I'll see you there.